Okay, well, maybe let's go ahead and get started. It's 5 after the hour. Does that sound good? Thumbs up,
Sounds good.
silence, hearts. Okay, fantastic. Wonderful. Um, okay. Hello and welcome to the Feral File Retrospective Conversation Series with Artists and Curators. My name is Elizabeth Sweet, and I'm the Communications Lead at Feral File. Today, we are here for a conversation with curators. Now, I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by Casey Reas, Christian Paul, Annika Meyer, Alex Estrick, Regina Harsani, and Rick Silva. Thank you all so much for being here. I didn't think we'd be able to pull this off with scheduling, but here we are, and I am so grateful. Now, before we get into it, I want to give a bit of context for why we're here. For the last 2 weeks, Feral File has been celebrating 2 years as a gallery in what we're calling the Retrospective, and two exhibitions take center stage. We have the Experiment and Feral File 1.0. So the Experiment is a reflection on A2P, which stands for Artist to Peer. It was a project curated by Casey Reas, Rick Silva, Addie Wagenknecht, and exonemo, in which artists were asked to create an artwork and swap with each other over the course of a week. We didn't have the language at the time, but these were NFTs, and that was 2019. So the model and spirit of A2P served as the foundation for Feral File, which opened its first exhibition in May 2021 with Social Codes, created by Feral File co-founder Casey Reas. And since then, Feral File has hosted 33 exhibitions with curators and artists from across the digital art landscape. Each exhibition begins with a distinct curatorial vision that, together, help tell the story of digital art in the 21st century. The Experiment reflects on A2P, spotlighting 19 artists and artworks from the 2019 project. And Feral File 1.0 is the celebration of all 33 exhibitions featuring one artwork from each. Curated by Casey Reas, Feral File 1.0 encompasses the breadth and depth of artists and artworks featured in the gallery. Now, over the last few days, we've had talks with incredible artists and curators whose energy and passion have helped make Feral File what it is today. And we've hosted 4 talks thus far during the retrospective, one on environments, bodies, generative art, and digital art versus NFT art. They've all been really great, and I encourage you to listen to them. You can find the first 3 on Twitter for now, and then soon they'll all be available on YouTube within the next few days. And today we're gathered for our 5th conversation, a conversation with curators. Casey, Christian, Annika, Alex, Regina, and Rick, thank you really all so much for making time and space for this conversation. I'm really excited. We're all very excited. Thank you so much. Now, I'd like to start by going over the exhibitions that you've all curated on Feral File in our first 2 years. There's really been such a range of depth and curatorial vision, and each exhibition is just so profound in and of itself. So I'd love to give some space to each of you to talk about your specific exhibition. So I'd love to begin with Christian. Now, Christian is the curator of digital art at the Whitney Museum of American Art and a professor in the School of Media Studies at the New School. She curated Chain Reaction in March 2023, which was the 28th exhibition on Feral File. Thank you so much for joining us today, Christian. Could you tell us a bit about Chain Reaction, which is a reminder that the attraction of NFTs ultimately resides in the network of people that collect and trade? That's a quote from the curatorial statement. So I'll let you take it away.
Sure. Thanks so much. For how long would you like me to talk? Obviously, I can talk the next 2 hours about this, which I'm sure wouldn't help the conversation. So I can give you a very brief overview. Thanks so much for the introduction. It was an absolute pleasure doing this show for Feral File. And what I was really interested in, as Elizabeth already hinted at, was this kind of tension and connection between NFTs as a mechanism for identification and the blockchain as a list of data blocks that facilitate the recording of transactions. So a kind of tracking fixed quality, and then really the social space of the blockchain. So this tension between, once again, an identification mechanism and a keepsake for a social contract and commitment or collective action. So I gave the artists participating in the show various prompts of how to play with the idea of creating a chain reaction, of setting in motion a process, and basically making their work function as a catalyst. And of course, my selection of artists was also geared towards basically nurturing a specific kind of engagement. So 3 of the projects in Chain Reaction dealt with more environmental issues. Marina Zurkau and Ira Greenberg's The Doris's oyster crab from silicon to salt water allowed people to collect digital NFT oysters, which had unique generative features. And those were then placed onto a reef on a website where the owners then would collectively vote on distributing funds to real world oyster conservation. Amelia Winger Bearskin Seed Protocol, Dynamical Lunar Indigenous Time consisted of 100 variations of a pile of corn seeds that imagined the texture of future generations of corn, and collectors had to make a commitment to engagement with seed banks. And Alfredo Salazar-Caro's project was ultimately devoted to reforestation. So as you purchased the work, you would also make contributions to an environmental cause. Jennifer and Kevin McCoy approached this from a much more art-centric perspective, since they opened up the artistic process to a group of donors and art supporters who had supported them before. And this was directly tied to a project that happened at the Whitney, where they opened up donorship to application. There's a lot more to say about that. But in their piece, Public View, Private View, the participants really became part of the art ecosystem in a very formal way by ultimately helping to create the art. They made donations of images that the McCoys then retraced. And some of the projects would ask people to collect basically sight unseen. So Sarah Ludi was playing with transient moments in a performance by asking collectors to purchase time codes associated with video clips that then together would create this recreate this 24-hour performance she had done before. And Stephanie Dinkins, the Okra Continuum, invited collectors to purchase NFTs that consecutively created a journey and travel of an okra pod, which really symbolized the journey east with Africans from pre-slavery times towards the future. Once again, there's a lot more to say about that. The work also had an AI component in its construction of the narrative in the background. So what I really loved about the show and doing the show was this engagement with social contracts, with a larger community in making commitments. And it also was very much a test case, because ultimately the blockchain and NFTs weren't built for doing what we were all trying to do. There were quite a few external websites created for the projects. It was pretty complicated, but once again, I think a fantastic experiment, and I'll leave it here.
Thank you so much. This exhibition is really profound to me. It really humanizes the blockchain and making it about people and how people have an impact both on their environment and then also the performance of the piece and how it manifests. Thank you so much for giving us that background. Next, I'd love to move to Annika Meyer. So Annika is a writer and curator who curated LeeMulliken.pcx, an exhibition of Lee Mulliken's early computer art. It was the 29th exhibition on Barrelfile, and it opened in May 2023. Annika, hello. Could you tell us a bit about LeeMulliken.pcx and what it was like bringing an iconic American artist's work to the blockchain, please?
Hi, thank you for having me. Good evening. Yeah, it was exciting to work with Cole Root from the estate of Lee Mulliken on this exhibition. He invited me to curate the exhibition because I've been working with another pioneer, Herbert W. Franke, that somehow happened accidentally because I went to visit him and then I recommended to him joining Twitter, and then that somehow exploded. And then I promised that I wouldn't leave because that was a bit of an overload of excitement from people. So that's when I also got to know, yeah, Cole and learned more about Lee Mulliken. And yeah, then we started. I think it was a really interesting collaboration for the two of us because he, as the director of the estate, is very familiar with the work. And he gave me, I think, about 30 or 40 pieces to choose from. And we, in the end, decided to release, I think, 12 pieces. And yeah, I think we took 4 or 6 weeks to actually really choose the pieces. And Lee Mulliken was actually already 67 when he started, yeah, to really work with the computer. And he's actually a painter. That's also how he approached working with computers. He sort of brought that idea of his painterly technique to the screen. And yeah, it was the idea was to actually show the depth of the work. There was a lot of figuration, and then there was also a lot of abstraction. And yeah, I think we somehow ended up in the middle. And yeah, for Lee Mulliken, working with the computer was also a lot about freedom. Um, and excitement and joy, and a lot about experimentation. And the interesting part about, I think, about sort of bringing the work of a pioneer to the blockchain, you hear a lot that pioneers are sort of used to legitimize NFTs, but I think it's more like the other way around. Most of the pioneers haven't been able to sell their work prior, and finally they get the attention and recognition they deserve. So I guess as much as some of us or all of us might be annoyed by the hype, and that somehow, yeah, is more about floor prices and sold out drops and whatnot. In the end, the people who are really interested in art and got into digital art and collecting through crypto and collecting on art blocks early really are interested in learning more about pioneers. And I think that's quite beautiful. And I don't know if I'm allowed to ask Casey a question, because I know that Lee Mulliken is really important for him as an artist. So Casey, I would be really excited to hear a bit more about Lee Mulliken's influence on your own artistic practice.
Okay. Well, I think Lee Mulliken, the way that he worked across different media, always drawing, painting, making ceramics, writing, performing. I mean, I find that to just be like an extraordinary inspiration for how to live as an artist. And like myself, Lee taught for decades at UCLA. So the artworks in the show on Ferrofire were actually made in the building where I'm currently teaching. And so there's a lot of like local and personal sort of like resonance with me. But for me, it's mostly just that model of being open, exploring one's ideas in so many different ways. And then I think also with Lee coming to the computer so, late in life, I don't remember how old he was, but he's older than I am right now. Began painting with software on the computer, doing it out of passion. I think he got a lot of pushback and resistance at the time, but he wanted to do it. He did it. He put so much energy into it. And I think looking at his paintings from that time and looking at his computer drawings from that time and seeing how the two relate to each other, how ideas are flowing back and forth between media, I think Lee is just such an extraordinary model for how to live life as art. That's my thoughts about Lee. Thanks, Annika.
Thank you both. And I will just throw in something from yesterday's conversation with Tina Rivers Ryan, where Cole Root, the director of the Lee Mulliken estate, was on, and Tina asked, after saying that artists don't like labels, in one word, what would you want me to label your art as? And Cole said that on behalf of Lee, he would say spiritual. That Lee's output was part of a meditative and spiritual practice, his perpetual search for inner peace. So Nice little way to wrap that. Thank you both so much. Now I'd like to turn to artist and professor Rick Silva, who curated the third exhibition on Feral File, Fragments of a Hologram Rose. And Rick also co-curated A2P, which is our origin story. So Rick, hi, thank you so much for joining us. Could you tell us a bit about Fragments of a Hologram Rose, where, quote, artists were asked to imagine and create their own sci-fi plants and to interpret this prompt however they like? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's so nice to be here with so many familiar faces that I know from different parts of the art world, and go back over a decade with, as far as from net art scenes and things. So definitely nice to be here. Yeah, so that was the third ever exhibition on Feral File, and we're still figuring things out. And that was June of 21, so it's not super fresh in my mind, but it's my favorite thing that I've done in the NFT space. So I go back to it often. I like to talk about it. But yeah, as you mentioned, the prompt was for artists to. I was reading a book about plants and sci-fi and the way that different authors have kind of navigated that throughout the years, and it talked about the first published story that William Gibson published in 1977, which is called Fragments of a Hologram Rose. And there was he talks about how the hologram is, when fractured, every piece of the hologram still has the full image in it, even though it's fractured into, as you can cut up as much as you like. And I thought there was kind of a beautiful sentiment there with like digital art and NFTs and seeding and all the things that happen, and kind of thinking about blockchain and all the stuff that was happening at the time. And also this project was also, Feral File was, I think still largely these kind of series of editions of works. And I was thinking about editions as well too. So yeah, I reached out to the artists and asked them to, so like, as an artist myself who curates and organizes things, I kind of have this interesting access, and I'm just kind of a fan and my peers. And so there's folks that I knew were either working, kind of people who are working in 3D modeling or animation, mostly folks like that. And then, kind of art and design or cinema. And then also folks who are that I knew were interested in sci-fi. So the prompt was pretty simple, like, what could you do with this, thinking about a sci-fi plant. And so, so the folks that I asked was just a stellar group of artists: Andrew Thomas Wang, Brandon Blomart, Ido Radon, Kim Lawton, Kit Janae, Lawrence Leck, Nate Boyce, Peter Burr, Rosa Menkman, Sabrina Rattay, and Sarah Ludi. So just like some of my all-time faves, and just love to be in conversation and with those folks. And it was also interesting because I was kind of onboarding some folks for the first time onto the space, and kind of having that conversation that a lot of us were having around that time. And some of the works, like Roses, for example, was interestingly part critique of it and participating in it. And so I really respect folks that took that step with me. I know Peter was also that was, I think was his first show as well too. It's amazing to see what he's done with Feral File since. Just such a fan. And there was amazing little rhymes that happened between the works, between the different artists, and and I just invite you to go and check out the work. One of the prompts was also to make like a WebGL, GLD kind of object that you could navigate. And most of the artists had that as well, or a downloadable object that people could download too. So that would be almost like this idea of maybe like when you have a 3D object, it could potentially kind of seed itself into other projects too, and kind of escape and become something else. So there's a lot of metaphors there, both good and some stretches as far as like blockchains and plants and those kind of things. Yeah, it was also kind of a great experience too, because I think it was this idea of exchange, artist exchange, that was followed up from the A2P. This idea that we're all going to collect a piece of, we're all going to have a part in this, and kind of have a collection. The price point being accessible, I think, has always been something fascinating, even in that early time, where I couldn't necessarily, spend a couple $1,000s on my peers. I wanted to support my peers, but then, with Feral File, it's like, oh, okay, well, $77, I can do that. and that became a really great way to also kind of like tap into my own collector kind of, that I hadn't done since I was, a kid collecting comic books or collecting records or something. So that kind of was a nice spark there that happened with around that time with Feral File.
Thank you. It's so interesting to hear about like kind of the early days and how, some things have carried through and others haven't, and really, hearing about artists who started, just a couple of years ago with NFTs, but were digital artists for so much longer before then and have just really blossomed since. So thank you so much. Next, I'd love to turn to Regina Harstoni. Hi, Regina. Regina is the Associate Curator of Media Art at the Museum of Moving Image, and she curated On-Screen Presence in May 2022. This was the 16th exhibition on Feral File. And Regina, I'd love if you could tell us a bit about on-screen presence, which I think uniquely captures the process of an artist in creation mode. So yeah, would love to hear a bit about on-screen presence. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. I was inspired to do the show because in 2019, in November of 2019, I became very ill. And then the pandemic happened. So I was already like on my way to being bedbound right before we all, became isolated in March 2020. And then we become isolated in March 2020. And I was thinking a lot about lack of corporal access to artwork and my personal frustrations with the way that most institutions, galleries, even individual curators were responding to screen mediation and the inability to do brick and mortar exhibitions. I found it to be mostly, it felt like I was shopping for on Forever 21 or something more than I was looking at artwork. I didn't really want to look at a picture of a painting on a wall. I didn't have the same kind of visceral reaction, or, I'm the kind of person who gets like actual frisson when I'm in front of an artwork in the same space that I really respond to. So I wanted to find some solution to this frustration, and the first thing that came to mind was the history of artists working with webcams and doing live performance, and how you still might not be in the same exact space with that individual, but if it's live performance through a webcam, somehow you're still in the same temporal space and you can see through the screen into their habitat in some way and have some kind of access to their tangible artwork in real time. So I invited 5 artists from all different periods of their career. Another thing that was important to me was, and I think you kind of brought this up, and this comes up with Lee Mulliken too, it's, a lot of reinventing the wheel was happening post 2021 with media art, people thinking that artists working with digital tools was new, which I kind of wanted to fight against that as well. So we included Golan Levin and John F. Simon Jr. in the show, who both have a longstanding, incredible career in media art. John F. Simon Jr. has a project, Every Icon, that has had many different iterations over the years, including being featured in the Whitney Biennale a few decades ago. And John was interested in making a woodblock print out of the configuration of the pixels. And I thought that was an incredible direction for the show, where the artists would do a live performance that you'd have to get tickets to. You'd only be able to see it live once ever. You had to be there with them. Then there would just be like the indexable recording. But during that performance, they would produce a tangible work of some kind. So for John, it was this woodblock print. And the woodblock print was what was for sale as a one-in-one piece for a collector. For Golan, it was a plotter drawing, but it was mapped using a microscope of different objects under that microscope. And I invited Death Beef as well, who has a background in metalworking, and invited their own body into the piece, where they have type 1 diabetes, and they use the blood sugar, the glucose number, to generate a drawing on their computer using a program they wrote in code. And then they, throughout the video, created this actual metal sculpture from that drawing. And then Leanna Lynn, who I had worked with before and maybe was the lesser known artist before the show at the time, created this entire miniature environment that ticket holders, it was a lottery system. A few of them were selected to control so that they could set off lightning and smoke into the space. And then Molly Soda released essentially videos from her archive and led a group of individuals who bought tickets to reorganize clips from the archive to create a new video that would then be auctioned. Yeah.
Thank you. That was great. I really love what you said about seeing through the screen. I'm going to think about that one. Next, I'd like to turn to Alex Esterick. Hi, Alex. He's the editor-in-chief of Right Click Save, and Alex co-curated Ecotone with Primavera Di Filippi and Stina Gustafsson. It was the 21st exhibition on Feral File, and it opened in September 2022. Alex, could you tell us a bit about Ecotone, please, which was a glitch-oriented exhibition?
Hey, yeah, Elizabeth, can you just confirm that you can hear me clearly? Because I'm a bit worried about the quality.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Perfect. I mean, ecotone. So an ecotone, in case anyone isn't familiar with the term, is a region of transition between two biological communities, which is richer in species than both. And so the principle of ecotone, which we were really grateful to Feral File for hosting, was this sort of community exhibition representing the community of both sort of engineers, traditionally trained fine artists, which was really a kind of motley crew and of hybrids principally. And I think Ecotone was in a sense a celebration of this sort of potential hybrid identity of sort of artists come engineers, artists come collectors, which seemed to be emerging in Web3. And that's what we were trying to explore. And the residency, which is a yearly residency in Eastern France, is really a kind of 3-week space for engineers and artists to come together. And of course, in a sense, we did a few texts, both on Feral File, one on Right Click Save, and one on Flash Art, around this sort of question of whether the identity of the artist is changing, whether it is genuinely hybrid, or whether that whether there's, in a sense, the division between artist and engineer is an artificial one. Now, it's clear, if you read the words of Isaac Patka, who's a wonderful engineer who's worked with Operator most recently on their Art Blocks drop. It's clear from what Isaac says that he feels like very much an engineer for whom working with an artist is a kind of interesting, dysfunctional, creative process. But if you listen to Sarah Friend, who's as well as a wonderful artist, also a wonderful software engineer, she says, "I didn't study engineering, although I have worked as a software engineer. Nor will I defend my qualifications as an artist. However, many years of code switching between these worlds has shown me their surprising unity. Both artists and engineers are concerned primarily with making things. The approach and motivations for the work can be different, but I prefer to see engineering as creative and art making as technical. I think that more can grow from the perception of unity than separation." So this project that we did on Feral File was a sort of attempt to, I suppose, visualize and crystallize that conversation, or that set of conversations that happened over the course of the Glitch residency. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much. Those nexus spaces are rich, and I know a big topic of conversation in this space. So thank you so much for telling us a bit about Ecotone. And last but certainly not least, Casey Reas, the co-founder of Feral File. Casey has curated 4 exhibitions, including Feral File 1.0, which is the cumulative exhibition open now as part of the retrospective. Other exhibitions that Casey has curated are Social Codes, which was the first exhibition and opened May 2021. Pixel, which was the 6th exhibition and opened September 2021, and then Graph, which was the 10th and opened in November of that year. Now, Casey, every Feral File exhibition begins with the curator. Can you tell us why this is critical to the ethos of the gallery, please?
I think it's like Ferrophile in some ways does things very different from how other things work within the larger art space. But I really believe that curation is essential. A lot of my, well, I have to say, my best experiences working have been in collaboration with curators, and specifically they've been group shows where the curator has really defined context and then selected a group of artists, brought those artists together for us to like collaboratively build the show, like on these different themes. And that was my vision for what Ferrophile should be at the very beginning, like even before the NFT boom happened, like back in 2020 when we were doing this. Essentially, at that point, everybody had lost their exhibitions. There were very few opportunities for artists. And I felt that Ferrophile needed to be a place where we would make opportunities for curators and make opportunities for artists to continue showing work at this moment when everything was really shut down. And so like within the early days of Ferrophile, the reason I curated those 3 shows in the first year was to kind of seed everything, to seed Ferrophile with a few exhibitions of different types, to really focus on generative art. And then at that point, we opened things up. We had 2 open calls, and almost everything over the last year and a half has been a result of curators submitting proposals, and the exhibitions have come out of that open call. For me, this was really an experience of like being on the other side, like as an artist, not as someone with curatorial experience. Having an opportunity to have studio visits with the artist, having an opportunity to create a social space for artists to work together. Honestly, I wasn't expecting to love it as much as I did. So after the first show, Social Codes, that led to the Graph show and the Pixel show. And I think this idea of bringing artists together, of working with them and building these shows in a communal way, and then of the artists all like trading artworks, which has been a part of Ferrophile since the very beginning, and sharing work with each other was just really an essential point to how Ferrophile was built from the very first day.
Thank you. That method, or that ethos of collaboration and storytelling, I think is really what I is really what I take away from Ferrophile. And I'm not a trained curator, probably pretty obviously. And I'd venture to say that at least a few of the people who have curated exhibitions on Ferrophile are not trained either to be curators. Nonetheless, we think and we talk about curation quite a lot. Like you said, Casey, it's immensely important for obvious reasons, and then perhaps in some less obvious ways as well. From what I observe, curation can be about connection, leadership, making choices, and storytelling. So storytelling, digital storytelling, is interesting because there's this disembodiment to it, yet it's also got this uniquely immersive element. Like Regina was saying, with on-screen presence, you can really see through the screen. And you can become fully consumed by the contents of a screen, yet the context of the work must be fully communicated through like really only 2 senses of the 5 primary senses, sight and sound. The other senses are suspended and surrendered to whatever space the individual or the audience inhabits. So when the space is uncontrollable, we look to time. And how much time can someone spend with a piece of art, with a collection, with an exhibition? The ubiquity of handheld devices, of cellular data and Wi-Fi across the world, it increases the opportunity for people to spend time with digital art. Yet, technology and the space that we're in seems that time is compressed, and the distance between what we can experience is compressed even further. A file is sent much faster than a painting. You can share works in progress much more frequently with friends in Sao Paulo, Tokyo, Rome, all over the world. And part of the fun of A2P in 2019 was that works were created somewhat quickly in order to be swapped within only a week. So the rate of the NFT market, can feel like drinking water from a fire hose. It's insanely fast and hard to keep up. And there is this inherent speed to it, but that makes it simultaneously unifying, exhilarating, and super challenging to keep up. So my question is, can digital art and well-curated stories help us slow down? And what are the time-bound challenges and advantages of curating art and text-based narratives through digital mediums and exhibiting in digital galleries? I would love to hear your thoughts on this, on time, and how storytelling can help us maybe slow down in an age where things are moving so quickly.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question, Elizabeth. And I wouldn't necessarily say that, at least for me, the goal has been to slow things down. Of course, you can. I always define curating as creating a narrative in space, narrative in a broad sense and in a loose sense. And then, of course, the space of a gallery for digital art is very different from the space of a network for it. And you're dealing with so many factors and particularly interfaces. So the interface of work itself and the interface of the whole web environment, and temporality really plays out in a super interesting way. And I think you can use this temporality in a very targeted way to do what you're talking about and slow down. But you also have to engage your audiences in so many different ways in order to enable that. I'll hand it over to Regina, who has things to say on the subject.
I have a really different approach, actually. I'm surprised that not all curators are thinking about slowing down with what's been going on the last couple of years. For me, I'm always thinking about that. And it was really important to me for my show that all the artists had 6 months to make their work. I couldn't have done this show unless I was given that much runway for the artists to conceptualize and have multiple studio visits with me. And some of the artists even did test runs of their entire performances and sent me videos of those, or did that like live with me before they opened. So it just felt like it was, in the best place, and like they had time. I wanted the opposite of what's been going on. And when it comes to narrative, I think, at least from my perspective, it's important for curators, or for myself at least, to not come up with some kind of narrative and then force artists to fit within that. Instead, I'm always thinking about artworks that inspire me, or artists whose practices inspire me, and being some kind of like vessel for that narrative, like finding the narrative through the works in that direction. And involving the artist directly in some collaborative way. So I also have a question, if anybody wants to answer it, is how long did you give your artists to make the works for your shows?
Just as a footnote, Regina, of course, creating a narrative in space for me is always about following the art. This has been my mantra. This has been what I've been teaching my students for decades. Imposing a narrative onto art is, I think, a rookie mistake one would make. And in terms of, you're making an important distinction, I think, between the time of the development of the show and then what happens in the engagement of the show. And we also had a fairly long conversation and development phase for Chain Reaction.
Rick, please.
Yeah, our turnaround was pretty short and a bit rushed. But like with a lot of the folks I was working with, were pretty used to that 2-3 month timeline in net art, or media art context, and so, but yes, that wasn't ideal. But I also think that there was a nice energy there that was happening too with the shorter time. One thought I had about slowing down, and that's one thing that I really appreciate about what Feral File does, is like formally there's a couple things that I think I haven't really seen it in other kind. I mean, I guess it's not. I'm not sure. There's more, but there were I think that when the first to have like a full screen, you can see all the works. You can really take your time. And multiple times I've had people, whether it's a show that curator, a show that I was in, told me like, "Oh, I just went through all the works," and just you're able to kind of pick your pacing, almost like walking to the next, to use the gallery museum metaphor, walk to the next one and just kind of sit with it. And I do that. I find myself doing that with the Feral File shows, right? Just kind of clicking through the entire show. So I really appreciate that. Also appreciate like the 1 hour, kind of window, or sometimes longer, where you're able to kind of experience the show before it becomes about collecting and and like think in the early days we always had the kind of the Zoom almost like openings, and you get kind of talk and meet the artists. And so I think especially in the early days of NFTs and drops and gotta get this, and so that I do think there was like just formally a few things that were nice about the profile, which did make you slow down a bit and take the works in.
I appreciate you saying that, and we have some exciting kind of developments coming up for the next phase of Feral File that directly speak to everything you've just said, which we'll get into later in the week. But I want to linger on this point for a second: the distinction between the time of development and the engagement. I'd love to hear what more of you have to say about this, about sort of how long it takes for something to happen, or for like something to kind of form and come to life, and then what that means afterwards, or like how you sort of release it. I'd be interested to hear, Annika, about, you were kind of given all of these pieces by Lee Mulliken, and then you had to curate the collection, and just so I'm curious about sort of how the development of that process went, rather than the development of making the piece, how that relates to the engagement, and how you kind of see the distinction of time there.
I think we also worked like 6 months on the exhibition, and it was quite nice having time to look at the pieces and then put them aside, and then a week or two after look at them again, and then take another 2 weeks. And I think what Feral File does really well is working on the narrative and the storyline with curators, and in this case, the estate. I guess that's something that's really important, especially when an exhibition happens online, to provide a curator's note or an essay, and have an interview with the artist, or just provide text and context, because what we see often is artists just tweeting by this and that, and that also plays in how much time do people actually take to experience the work or look at it. So often it's about, here's a drop, it sells out, and then people trade. But I think what Feral File does is really wants people to engage with the art and learn about the artist, an exhibition, be it a group show or a solo show. And what we're doing at expanded.art, and I guess that might be a bit easier because people just walk into the gallery, and then because it's a gallery space, it's not a massive museum. So people come to us and speak with me basically about the show. So we really have time to speak with people, and then I know that I can make sure that people really learn about the storyline and the narrative and everything. So I think it's really important that Feral File really takes the time to work on these texts, that they're really good, and that everything is in there. And really takes the time to give feedback, so that when people read the text, it's actually very comprehensive. And I think that's quite important these days.
Thank you. And I want to make sure that Alex and Casey, that you have a moment to speak on this as well. And I think what Annika said about the narrative and sort of the storytelling reminds me of, Alex, what you do with Right Click Save, where you feature longer form articles and interviews with artists. And what's your perception about kind of slowing down and really kind of digging into an artist's practice or process? I'd love to hear.
I'm not sure I have anything particularly interesting to say on this subject. I was party to a text that Charlotte Kent wrote, which was on block time. And I think that was a kind of interesting discussion about how blockchain doesn't operate on time per se, but quantity of blocks, to which humans then assign a familiar temporality like minutes and seconds. I know this isn't really the question you asked, but I do think a lot about how the blockchain, in a sense, or block time, isn't time as we knew it, but it's something more like time space. And I think there are a lot of artists that folks in this call have curated who I think engage really interestingly with that idea, and also the notion of the blockchain as a sort of inviolable repository or time stamping device is obviously something that's been shown to be compromised by artists like Simon Denny and so on. So I think maybe I'm more, I think the question originally was about the time spent by artists to produce, and perhaps the time involved or the duration involved in experiencing works. I would say that in a sense, if space and flatness was the sort of essence of modernist painting, then I do think that the question of time has become perhaps the most essential topos for whatever we're going through right now. So, but yeah, quite sort of an elusive conversation. So apologies.
I mean, Alex, the idea of spending time with the work is really largely what the premise of an online gallery was about for me with Ferrophile. I think I spent so many years installing work in spaces in London or New York. I would work for, a year. The work would be up for a month, and then it would go down and nobody would ever be able to see it again. And so I think the thing about working in a physical space is you have like a lot of control over the environment, over the projection, over the sound. But then, like, what can we do with an online gallery when everything is based in the browser? And it's not just documentation of work, but the work is really meant to live in the browser. We give up a lot, of course, but what do we gain? And what we really gain is access. So I think the fact that Ferrophile shows have openings, but they don't close. Like, I can still go and visit Def Beef and Golan's, performances on Ferrophile. And a lot of the work that Ferrophile shows is time-based work. And that's another thing too. It's like you're moving through a museum. How much time do you have to really sit down and experience the work? I think one thing about having work in the browser is that you can open it full screen, as Rick said. You can really spend time with it. You can, a couple months later, remember it and come back to it, open it full screen and spend time with it. And so I think this way of work that's time-based and work that's generative, work that is never the same from one moment to the next, I think understanding that work, it requires time. And in a gallery space, you never have access to it all the time, or you're never in that city all the time. And so that's what I'm so excited about with these online shows.
Thank you all so much. I want to move on to kind of a next point, but it's related, and especially to what Casey said about gaining access. So curators seem to detect the signal through the noise, right? Contextualizing the stories that are worth telling. And there are infinite stories out there inhabiting every corner of the world and, like, dare I say, universe. But the internet and the growing network of digital artists have given us the means to unearth stories otherwise hidden in communities that have not been prioritized economically, politically, or socially. Yet when we think about the audience, we're typically speaking to a majority in some sense. We're giving access to some that haven't had access, or there's this big question of access to both knowledge and experience. So in our talk yesterday on digital art versus NFT art, we discussed the ways in which digital art is blanketed with terms like augmented reality, when really there are factions and granularities of the art form that are highly relevant, yet largely inaccessible to larger audiences. And quite frankly, like, I'm ignorant to a lot of those. But calling something AR is more digestible and labeled to reach the many rather than the knowing few. And so it's this question of access, right? How specific do you get? How general do you get? So when you're curating an exhibition or telling a story, what is lost when you're trying to contextualize something created in opposition to or completely departed from the audience you're trying to reach? And then in converse, what can be gained?
Yeah, another fantastic question. So I think this is actually a question that the art world per se faces. I think working at a museum and curating for a museum, you have those exact same questions about access, reaching a larger public. Of course, it's a space that also requires buying tickets, so it's a different demographic. So the flavor of it all very much changes when you're working online. But the question at heart really is the same. And it's always an incredible balancing act, because you don't want to dilute the sophistication of the art, the approaches, the material, the language that the artists speak and that relates to a work. And on the other hand, you don't want to turn off people, and basically chase them away with jargon. I think the online environment is particularly forgiving in that way. You find so many different types of niche audiences that become interested and engage. And there's also more space for a dialogue, to all of the points that Casey made, returning to the artwork, spending more time with it, realizing that somebody is out there and having a conversation with them. So the whole basically context changes a lot from physical space to online space, and I've always loved working in online spaces. So on the one hand, there's a lot to be gained. I think in each of the spaces you also lose on various levels. You pointed to the whole speed of the NFT blockchain environment, for example, that really sucks you in, and there needs to be a kind of resistance to that to have people engage longer term. So once again, a lot more to say about this, but it is a balancing act.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And it's interesting that the online environment is more forgiving. Does anyone else have anything to add about sort of how the online environment can expand what people can access, whether that's like by knowledge or experience? I'd be interested to hear.
I just wanted to shout out Christiane. She didn't do it herself, that she's been working with Artport, the Whitney, created Artport at the Whitney for a very long time now, well before Feral File, which from a museological perspective is giving access, archivable access to media art. So yeah, shout out to that. And to also say, like, as this conundrum is definitely an institutional issue too, it's also just about education, even specifically education in America around art appreciation. I struggle personally with where do I place language to reach as many people as possible, the AR versus augmented reality conversation. I tend to try to be more invested, and I know it's not a perfect answer in educating students on what these terms mean and empower them to feel confident in using those vocabularies.
I feel the online space is really good for work that is interactive, like work that really requires performing. Like, for example, on the Social Code show, there was a piece by Raven Kwok and a piece by Maya Mann that really the foundation of the work was really engaging with it and sort of modifying it and performing it. And I think that, the home space or the personal space that a phone or the home really provides is a good space for feeling comfortable with that. And then in another way, like for the generative work, like, for example, some of that work, for example, the graph show, there were around 30 plotter drawings made for each artist in that show, but then every single software included an indeterminate number of different options. So I think you can just move through those and you can see 1,000 variations, 10,000 variations, 100,000 variations. And I think that the space of the browser is a really good place for that kind of like that volume that really shows what the fundamental nature of some generative work is. And I think that's harder to convey in a physical space.
I think one of the things that I do in my practice, and I know a few of the artists that I curated into my show do, is also we just version different works for different spaces. So we'll have the online version, and we'll have the offline or the installation or the performance version. And it's, they kind of, I don't know, I guess like music or film becomes a good metaphor for that, to kind of distribution. And we're thinking about, how you version different pieces. For example, going back to Rosa Menkman's piece for the Fragments of Hologram Rose, she did a project called the Shredded Hologram Rose. And then she's since then just turned it into a lecture performance. Most recently did it at Transmedial. So it's like it's not necessarily like you're locked in, and actually so often we're asked to reversion it, or that becomes like an interesting way to like have something that's a seed that then grows into something else, or changes over time too.
Annika or Alex, do you have anything to add?
Nothing useful.
I guess it's easier to have a conversation online. That's also why I prefer, as a writer, to write for online mediums than publish a text in a. I also used to write for big German newspapers, but that I actually found really boring because I never got any feedback. And I guess that's also sort of somehow true for online exhibition, right? Or also doing a gallery show, just us being on Twitter and now us being here in this space, like people from all over the world speaking with each other. So I think, yeah, online exhibitions might also somehow might make it easier for people to communicate about an exhibition, or maybe even collecting NFTs. Yeah, creates more of a community around the art. Excuse me, not saying anything against museums. I love museums. I also curated museum shows, so that's also beautiful. But I think that's one of the positive side aspects of doing things online, that sometimes it's easier to have conversations with people because you don't go into a museum and then just randomly speak with with people. But that actually really happens on Twitter.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. I do want to be mindful of time. We've hit the hour. This has been a really great conversation, and I invite you all to, if you have any questions for each other, please feel free to ask. I do have one more question, sort of a hot seat question, and yeah, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. So, in this sort of theme of storytelling and curation and telling, sharing a narrative, not imposing a narrative, and creating access to new and different forms of art and artists. What is a story that you would like to be told on Feral File or in the greater digital art space in the next 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years in the future?
I'm just going to listen to this one, Elizabeth, and write everything down.
I just wanted to say, you're asking us to curate your shows here. You have a terrific lineup for doing that. Well, I would say in a very simple way, keep doing what you're doing, and more specifically, what I also mean by that is, I think creating these connections between more established artists, pioneers, as Annika said, moving into these space, and emerging artists who, in particular, I would say, whom we haven't seen in the gallery scene and in the museums yet, and putting them in dialogue. And I think another strength of Feral File was really taking the pulse of this environment and engaging with its possibility. I mean, the blockchain and the whole NFT space in a more critical way, rather than just cranking out NFTs for profit. So I think those are strengths that you should keep up in different ways.
I want to commend Feral File and Casey and the team for this kind of reset that you're doing right now with the 2 exhibitions, the kind of the rewind and kind of look at what's happened, and then also going back to A2P. I think that is so interesting. It's like people are so interested in, like, I don't know, it's interesting, for sure, interesting summer, interesting time thinking of what happened 2 years ago this time and what's happening now. And I think it's really shining that Feral File has always been about the ideas, always been about the artists, and here we are having this like really great conversation and exciting moment around that and celebrating what's happened so far, and it's just really exciting. And I have no idea, at the moment, like what'll happen in the next 5 years. But I do love this current moment and reset. Again, I don't know if it's a reset or what you categorize it, Casey, but it's I think it's a really beautiful moment. Thank you.
It's like a phase shift and evolution at the same time. Yes. Like experimenting for 2 years nonstop, like who we are, and like building like a next step based on the result of all that sort of work with you. Like every single show we experimented, we built new things. We built so much for Regina. It was amazing. Rick, like yours was the first show where there was like so much like hybrid between different kinds of media. And so through all of this, sort of the next phase is like, how do we learn from that and keep growing into the future?
I'll say, keep it critical, be the medicine, the antidote against the toxic positivity conversation that started a few years ago. Make sure that artists can question and even subvert your own platform, because I think that will keep it interesting. Continue to show challenging work.
I would also say just keep doing what you're doing, and I guess Feral File is definitely my favorite platform for digital art out there. And I guess don't be intimidated by not selling out immediately. I think that's also a strength. And I think all of us, everyone in here, we've been in this for so long. I guess it will take a bit more time that people really learn about the history and about the artist with a traditional digital art background. So I think we just need to be patient and and not fall into the hype trap. And I think you're doing a perfect job. So just be patient with yourself, and I hope there's enough funding to go through this.
Thank you all so much. I think with that, if there are no more comments or questions, we can call it a close. I do want to linger on what Rick was saying about how we're looking back to move forward, and we really are. And these last 2 weeks for the retrospective are completely non-commercial, nothing's for sale, and so much time and energy has been poured into it, and it's been absolutely incredible and so humbling for for our whole team to just experience all the energy and enthusiasm around Feral File in the last 2 weeks. I mean, we know and we feel the love all the time, but really, it's just been extraordinary. So really, thank you all for being here today, for all of you listening, for everyone who's been keeping up with the conversations. It's really been extraordinary. And so we'll go ahead and close. And I, again, just want to thank you all so much for joining us today. To Christian, Annika, Alex, Regina, Rick, and Casey, seriously, my sincerest gratitude. And to everyone listening, thank you for making time this summer for the retrospective, and this evening, afternoon, wherever you are, whatever time it may be. If you're listening to the recording, thank you for doing that as well. Tomorrow, we close the retrospective with a conversation between Casey Reas, Chris Coleman, and Charlotte Kent. It's a discussion about what Feral File proposed, how it went, and the direction we're taking moving forward. We'll have a Q&A at the end as well, and that's at 1 p.m. tomorrow Eastern. And then on Thursday, we are so excited to launch the next phase of Feral File with N=12, an exhibition curated by the one and only Aaron Penne. N=12 is a deeply beautiful and collaborative exhibition featuring Ana Lucia, Nadia Bremer, Daniel Katt, Riva Fan, Peter Pasma, Elsif, Leah Coleman, Bart Simmons, Raylan Ark, Nicole Vela, Ipsketch, and Melissa Witterek. And it's truly an astounding collection. And we'll have a Twitter space to celebrate the opening at noon Eastern on Thursday. There are a lot of new exciting features for viewing and collecting, things that have been kind of brought up here today in this conversation. We're going to have an extended viewing period, a shorter collecting time. And what we're really trying to do is celebrate the art, give more time and space for the art to breathe, for the collections to breathe, for the whole exhibition itself to be celebrated as a whole. So please keep an eye out for more information, and join the upcoming conversations to learn more. So again, I just want to thank you all for being here with us today. It's really been a joy to host these conversations and to moderate today, with all the artists and with curators and leaders in this space. Really thank you all so much again, Casey, Annika, Alex, Regina, Rick, and Christian. And with that, I wish you all a great evening, afternoon, day, everything. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Profile.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, Michael, we can go ahead and close it. Thank you all. I hope you have a great evening. Take care.